Okay, maybe.
First,
All right.
if you could say and spell your name for me.
It's Bill Murrah. I spell Bill with a B, and Murrah is Murrah.
So for somebody that may have no idea, what is the 8th of August?
Okay. The 8th of August is our region's answer to or parallel to what's known in much of the country as Juneteenth. Juneteenth is celebrated in much of the country. It grew out of Texas. It's June the 19th, and it's celebrated as Emancipation Day. In our region, the 8th of August is celebrated as Emancipation Day. And for a long time, many people in East Tennessee thought that the 8th of August had only been celebrated in 2 or 3 different communities, Newport, Greenville, Knoxville. But then over the last few years, we've come to realize that the 8th of August has been celebrated at least at some point in 6 states and over 50 communities and over 150 years. So how did it get started being celebrated as Emancipation Day in this region? To really go back and give the deepest background, we could start in 1842. And in 1842, a man who was to become president, Andrew Johnson, bought 2 slaves, Dolly and her half-brother Sam. And he bought them in a slave auction near Parrottsville, Tennessee. And according to legend, Dolly was able to persuade Andrew Johnson to buy her because she thought he had a kind face. So, and she also persuaded him to purchase her half-brother. So in 1842, they went to live in the Johnson household in Greenville. And Johnson was a tailor, and his wife was an invalid much of the time. And so Dolly then later had 3 children, Florence, Lizzie, and William. William was the youngest. And then her half-brother Samuel was also in the household. Many people, including family members, believe and assume, in a sense, they feel they know that Florence, Lizzie, and William were the children of the future president, Andrew Johnson. And it's no doubt that they had an unusual relationship, that those children had an unusual relationship with Andrew Johnson. They felt that they were treated very kindly, and he would buy toys for them. And we know from written and material and interviews that both Samuel and William were musicians. I interviewed a woman one time who was a child in the household where William lived here in Knoxville. She referred to him as Uncle Will. And she said that he was an accomplished pianist. And we know from other material that Samuel not only could play the violin, but he actually made the violin that he played. So they were people with some skills. On 8th of August, 1863, according to William in later newspaper articles, etc., and interviews, Ms. Johnson came in and told the slaves that they were free. So there's strong, while there's no documentation, written documentation that it happened on that day in Johnson's papers, there's very strong circumstantial evidence that in fact the slaves of Andrew Johnson were in fact freed on the 8th of August, 1863. Dr. Paul Bergeron, in an interview, had told me a couple of times that in the papers that he had charge of at the University of Tennessee, the Andrew Johnson papers, that there was nothing in those papers that documented that Andrew Johnson had freed his slaves on that day. But the oral history is pretty clear from the descendants of the people who were formerly slaves. And also there were significant changes in Andrew Johnson's thinking right around that same time that point to that being a pivotal time in his attitude towards slavery. So in 1863 then, after the Emancipation Proclamation, Andrew Johnson freed his personal slaves. Now, why would they have not already been freed? Because the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in January, on January the 1st, 1863. But the Emancipation Proclamation only covered the states that were then in rebellion. Tennessee, on the other hand, had already been occupied by the federal military. And so Tennessee was, in a sense, already liberated, or, back in the federal fold. And Andrew Johnson, we understand, persuaded President Lincoln not to include Tennessee at that time. So after he freed his personal slaves on that day, we really don't have information for the next 8 years about that day, the 8th of August. But we have a newspaper article from 1871 that describes a special event on that day. It was in the Knoxville Chronicle, but it was referring to an event in Greenville. And it tells that on that day, there was a parade that went out from town, and Samuel Johnson was the captain of the parade. And then when they reached their destination, which was Tusculum, which is east of Greenville, then there were speeches that included a speech by Andrew Johnson, the former president at that point. So that's very clear. On that day, there was a celebration of the 8th of August on the 8th of August, 1871. So after that time, there appear in Greenville and Knoxville papers references to celebrations of the 8th of August in Greenville. In the 1880s, 200 people got on a train and went to Greenville to celebrate the 8th of August. In Johnson City, there was a celebration in 1897 where several hundred people from Knoxville actually went on a dedicated excursion train. The whole train was made up of people going to Johnson City to celebrate the 8th of August. By 1899, there was a celebration in Knoxville. It appears that from research that I've done, that may be the first celebration in Knoxville. In 1900, 3,500 people came to Knoxville on excursion trains from out of town to join with local people in celebrating the 8th of August. They came from as far away as Birmingham. In 1902, we're jumping now to Nashville just to show that by 1902, the celebration of the 8th of August had moved west. In 1902, 500 people got on a paddle wheel steamer and chugged up the Cumberland River to Clarksville and joined with 3,000 to 5,000 other people to celebrate the 8th of August in Clarksville. So throughout the teens, 20s, 30s, there are newspaper articles describing celebrations of the 8th of August. In 1921, there's an article that not only talks about the origins of the 8th of August being the freeing, Andrew Johnson's freeing of his personal slaves, but it gives credit to Samuel Johnson as the person who somehow helped spread the celebrating of the 8th of August through the region. He died in 1912, so we've never quite been able to understand how he propagated it, how he spread the celebration. But he was given credit for doing that. By 1935, in Memphis, 10,000 people celebrated the 8th of August in a number of churches around town. And then there was a special event at the Booker T. Washington High School where there were 25 former slaves plus 1,000 people and some major African American speakers from around the Southeast and as far away as Chicago. So in 1937, Louis Armstrong played at the 8th of August celebration in Knoxville. And now on to the current time, we've been able to identify, as I said earlier, over 50 communities where the 8th of August has been celebrated at some time in history over the last 150 years. Those include everywhere from the big one in Memphis to people celebrating on the banks of the Powell River in Hoop Creek, which is up in Claiborne County. I had an interview with a man named Sam Tucker who told me that when he was a teenager they would go out to the banks of the Powell River and African Americans from that little community of Hoop Creek, Tennessee would go to celebrate emancipation from slavery. I talked to a woman named Fannie Jones who as a girl lived in a coal camp in Benham and Lynch, Kentucky, up near in Harlan County, and she said that people didn't work on the 8th of August and the coal mines paid for refreshments and people had baseball games and celebrations locally in Kentucky. Paducah, Kentucky has a huge celebration every year, including parades. The people come from out of town. They plan weddings and homecoming events on the 8th of August every year, even now. I interviewed the director of the Missouri Historic Society, and he told me that in Missouri they celebrate August 4th as Emancipation Day. When I described what had happened, what was happening in Tennessee, Kentucky, and a little bit over into Arkansas, Missouri, northern Mississippi, southwestern Virginia, that the 8th of August was celebrated, he said he was certain in his own mind that the 4th of August celebrations in Missouri would have been an outgrowth or expansion of the 8th of August celebrations in Tennessee. He said that in 1877, after the Compromise of 1877, that when black people were basically, their rights were compromised by Democrats in the South, then a lot of laws were passed in Tennessee that limited the rights of African Americans. And a lot of African Americans fled Tennessee in something called the Great Exodus and moved into Missouri. And he believes that during that time period that people may have brought the celebration of emancipation to Missouri. And to this day in Joplin, Missouri, and in other communities in Missouri, Emancipation Day is celebrated at the first, at the first of the month of August. As we look at why people celebrate, the context of why people celebrated the 8th of August, and I think it's important for people to realize that may not have been an easy thing for people to do. For one thing, people were celebrating freedom, but yet really weren't yet free. For example, in Alabama, we had people coming from Birmingham to Knoxville to celebrate emancipation, but very few black people in the state of Alabama could vote, even up into the 50s and early 60s. So there wasn't real freedom, but yet they were celebrating freedom in a way that I think encouraged a yearning for freedom. So they weren't just celebrating something that had happened in the past, they were also recognizing something within themselves, a real desire to keep the struggle alive and keep the flame alive that freedom might come in the future. If we can remember, the context, this is a time, there's a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, and that's a description of the tremendous outmigration of African Americans from the South. 6 million people outmigrated from the South over 6 decades. People were fleeing the South in droves. The South was an incredibly repressive place for African Americans. A lot of African Americans lived in what now we would call a state of terrorism, where they were not even allowed. My dad has told me about being in a town in Georgia where if a white person was walking along a sidewalk meeting an African American person, the African American person had to step off the sidewalk. And of course, there are many more horrible stories than that. Estimates of people who were lynched range from 3,000 to 6,000 people. And in the book, The Warmth of Other Suns, she said that a person was being lynched about every 4 days in the South. So people were fleeing the South. It was a time when back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a system called the prison lease system. There's a documentary called Slavery by Another Name, and it's based on a book by that same name, and about the prison lease system. The focus of the book and the documentary is mostly on Alabama and Georgia, but the system also existed in Tennessee and other parts of the South, and it was incredibly brutal. So I'm mentioning those things to try to lay out the cultural, political, and social context that people were living in, so that when they took a train to go celebrate freedom, they were celebrating the freedom literally from slavery that had happened in the 1860s, but they were also yearning, they had a yearning and a desire for freedom they didn't yet have. So at these celebrations, how did that get acted out? Well, it may sound somewhat innocuous and unimportant. There were beauty contests. There were speeches. There were often baseball games. That doesn't sound like they weren't very political activities. But in a way, they have a political tinge to them, I think. Because we have to remember that beauty was identified as having white skin for women, white, very light skin, and straight blonde hair. And an African American woman, it was impossible for her to meet up with the standards of beauty in the larger culture, in the white culture, the dominant culture, should I say. So there were beauty contests to recognize African beauty. And so in a way, it was just an ordinary beauty contest, but in another way, it had deep social and political implications. We're talking about baseball games at a time when black baseball players couldn't play in the major leagues. There were the Negro leagues that came, but people were able to highlight their athletic abilities through the baseball games. Speakers were able to talk about emancipation and freedom in an environment where people weren't yet really free. Some people told me, this is very interesting, several people told me, we did not celebrate freedom on July 4th. So, because we were not free on July 4th, 1776. We celebrate freedom on the 8th of August because that's the day we were freed. So a lot of African Americans in our region identified with those people who were freed by Andrew Johnson and say we collectively, we were freed on the 8th of August, 1863. I think the 8th of August has a lot of relevance to all people today, and that's why I'm interested in it. It may surprise some people to learn that I'm white. But it's an important day for me because celebrating, the 8th of August has been celebrated for over 150 years by the people who know most about what it was like to be unfree. I mean, who knows more about the lack of freedom and unfreedom than people who were slaves? So who knows most about the sweet joys of freedom than people who had the least of it? And to me, the fact that people have carried that candle and handed it from generation to generation, decade to decade, down through the years, this candle of freedom, lighting the next one, so that over the decades, that freedom has continued to be celebrated. It has relevance to all people. I think of women who are freed from an abusive relationship. They often call their friends together and say, "Let's go celebrate." People who have gone through therapy because they were abused as a child, and they reach a milestone where they felt they've really dealt with this. They say, "Let's go celebrate." But what if there were 4 million people who had been abused as a child, and 4 million families who had been severely physically abused, and all at once they were freed? Well, what kind of outburst of joy and celebration must that be? And that's what the 8th of August is. There were 4 million people who found freedom during that same time period. For me, I think I look back and I ask the question, why is it important for me? I had an abusive father, and so I feel freed from that. I'm happy about that. But I also think about looking at it from a spiritual angle. The Jewish community is a minority in Knoxville in Tennessee, but many of us celebrate the freeing of the Israelites from Egypt. And we often we use that as a touchstone for how God or how the holy is involved in our lives and acts in history, and even people who are not Jewish. And so I think it's important for all of us to recognize both the time when the Jews came out of slavery in Egypt and to celebrate when African Americans came out of slavery in this country. And that not just to celebrate the people who gave them their freedom, but to celebrate the fact that African American people have refused to let that memory die. There is a side story to the 8th of August story, which I find to be very interesting. And it has to do with, the short version is that in 1937, then President Franklin Roosevelt gave William Andrew Johnson a silver-headed cane. Well, that's not enough information to tell the whole story, because why did Franklin Roosevelt give William Andrew Johnson a silver-headed cane? And so remember, William Andrew Johnson was the son of Dolly, who was purchased in 1842. William was born in 1858, so he was 5 years old on the 8th of August, 1863. William, after freedom, after becoming an adult, he moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, and he was working in Weaver's Cafeteria downtown. In 1936, President Roosevelt came to Knoxville and dedicated Norris Dam, the first TVA dam. Well, William had wanted to meet the president and to tell him, I was a slave of a previous president in the 1860s. And this was 70 years later, remember. But William was not able to arrange to meet the president when he was in town. During that same time, Ernie Pyle, who was a famous journalist at the time, very popular, was in Knoxville. And he was eating at Weaver's cafeteria. And so someone said, "Oh, Mr. Powell, did you know William Johnson, who works here, was a former slave of Andrew Johnson back in the 1860s?" And he said, "Oh, no." So William came out and met Ernie Powell. And William told him of his desire to meet Franklin Roosevelt. Ernie Powell wrote this in one of his columns in early February of 1937, and wrote about William, Mr. Johnson, and of his desire to meet the president. The president read the article, and about 2 weeks later, there was a Secret Service car in Knoxville picking up William to take him to the White House. So William goes to the White House, I think it was February the 17th, 1937, and Franklin Roosevelt presents him with a silver-headed cane, and on one side, the newspaper articles at the time said it had Franklin Roosevelt's name, and the other side it had William Andrew Johnson. So William was very proud of this cane, and newspaper articles about this meeting that were printed at the time showed William holding the cane. And it was said that that the cane never left his side, even when he was quite ill and dying in 1943. The cane was beside his bed. Well, the cane disappeared after 1943. And those of us who were interested in the 8th of August story had always talked about the silver-headed cane as being this treasure that we would love to be able to find sometime. But none of us knew where it was. We had no idea. It was a lost treasure. Well, meanwhile, setting that story aside, I was doing some research about the descendants of Samuel Johnson, William's uncle, because Samuel was the person credited with propagating the celebration of the 8th of August. I wanted to know what his descendants knew about this. So after some research, we found a descendant, and his name is Ned Arter. Fortunately, there was only one Ned Arter in the United States, which made it easy to find him. So, and Mr. Arter lives in Louisville, Kentucky. Well, by going on the internet, I was able to find a phone number, and I called this number. And I said, "Is Mr. Arter there?" And he came on the phone. And I explained that I was interested in learning about his great-great-grandfather, Samuel Johnson, and I was wondering what he could tell me about him. And I paused, and Mr. Arter said, "I don't know anything about him." So I was crushed because I'd spent some time trying to get this information. He said, "You know, Mr. Murrah, I don't know very much about my family history. To tell you the truth, in here in my closet, there's an old cane. It's got kind of a metal head on it, and it has Franklin Roosevelt's name on one side, and I don't even know where it came from." So I told Mr. Arter, I said, "Listen, I can't speak right now, but just give me a moment and I'll tell you the story of your cane." And so after I was able to collect my composure, I told him the story of the silver-headed cane. And I said, well, not only on one side does it should have the president's name on one side, but on the other side it should have William Andrew Johnson. He said, "I don't think so. Let me go look." So he went and got the cane, and faintly on the other side was William Andrew Johnson. So we had found the silver-headed cane. Mr. Arter came to Knoxville and showed it around with other people, and to Greenville to an 8th of August celebration there to share it with other people. And so that's the story of the silver-headed cane. It's a mystery to me how the celebration of the 8th of August as Emancipation Day spread from Greenville, Newport, Knoxville, and by 1902, Nashville, Clarksville, and then on to Memphis, Paducah, Missouri, It's uncertain to me how exactly that happened. To contrast that, I've talked to people in Asheville, and I've been assured by people there that the 8th of August was never celebrated there, as close as Asheville is to Greenville. So somehow this Emancipation Day was celebrated beginning in Greenville and moving mostly west. So perhaps that was just a matter of migration. It's possible. I one time spent some time thinking maybe someone sponsored the 8th of August celebrations, because in Johnson City for a while there was an insurance company that celebrated, that sponsored their celebration. I thought, oh, maybe it was an insurance company. I thought maybe it was some kind of institutional base for our network that through which the celebration was spread. But I contacted that insurance company. They checked in their archives. They couldn't find anything. Then I thought, well, maybe there was a bishop. Maybe there was a church. But there didn't seem to be a strong tie to a particular denomination. So some people have suggested it followed the railroads. That's possible. And it may just been a migration pattern. But I've never really been able to clearly determine how that happened. It could have also been some people who knew Andrew Johnson in Kentucky, or maybe there were other slaveholders who were releasing their slaves around the same time. Maybe there were some who were close to the Republican Party. Of course, there would have been very few, but that maybe had a network of their own. But that's a real mystery, and probably the major mystery of this whole celebration to me. Yeah, the 8th of August was celebrated by large numbers of people in many communities. It seems that some places celebrated for many decades. Some places may have only celebrated short periods of time. And some of the celebrations reached the level of sort of official recognition. I know that people from Johnson City used to go out to a park where Daniel Boone High School is, I think it is now, and Davy Crockett High School is now. It's Davy Crockett, not Daniel Boone. Excuse me. People from Johnson City used to go out to a park where Davy Crockett High School is now located, and people from Jonesboro would come as well. And so they would have free reign of the park on that day. So that had to have some sort of official stamp of approval. In Knoxville, the 8th of August celebrations were held in different locations early in the century, in the 1900s. But after a while, they really settled into Chilhowie Park. The Carl Cowan Park in West Knox County had some celebrations as well, but the bigger celebrations were at Chilhowie Park. And there would be thousands of people to attend. And as I understand, buses would run almost all night trying to help people get home because of the crowds being so large. So that meant that the city of Knoxville had to give a clear blessing for the celebration to be held at Chilhowie Park. Of course, African Americans could only attend the festivities that went on every day at Chilhowie Park one time a year, and that was on the 8th of August. Chilhowie Park wasn't like it is now. It was almost like a fair was there every day. There were rides, there were games and all that. And so African Americans could only look in from the outside and just wish that they could go. Bob Booker, who's a local historian, has told me that he would save his money so that he could go to Chilhowie Park the one day a year. But one year there was a polio scare, and his grandmother wouldn't let him go that year. So he had to wait 2 years to be able to go to Chilhowie Park for festivities.